The scorching Arizona sun had begun to dip behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the barren desert landscape. Sandy's hands gripped the cold metal arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white with tension. She had been in this chair for the past 3 years after a terrible accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. The accident had stolen her independence, but not her will to survive. Sandy had always been strong, independent, and driven. Before the accident, she had been a successful photographer, traveling the world to capture images of untouched landscapes and people. She had lived a life full of adventure, but all of that had changed in the blink of an eye when the car she was driving hydroplaned in a rainstorm and slammed into a tree. She had been with Paul, her husband, for 8 years. They had met at university, fallen in love, and married shortly after graduation. They had the kind of relationship everyone envied, or so she thought. Now, as the wheels of her wheelchair crunched over the gravel, the sinking feeling in her stomach grew stronger with every push of Paul's hands. He hadn't said a word since they'd left their small apartment in Phoenix that morning. He had seemed distant all day, his eyes clouded with something Sandy couldn't quite place. "Where are we going, Paul?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul didn't answer right away. His fingers tightened around the handles of her wheelchair, and he pushed her further into the desert, the heat radiating off the earth like a furnace. The air felt heavy, thick with dust and silence. Sandy's unease deepened. The scenery outside was unfamiliar, just endless miles of dry, cracked earth and scrubby brush. "We're going somewhere special," Paul finally replied, his voice flat, lacking the warmth it once had. His words sent a chill through Sandy. She knew him too well. He'd always been the type to hide his emotions, but there was something in his tone now that felt cold, too cold. "Paul, where exactly are we going?" Sandy's voice wavered. She had tried to hide her fear, but it was impossible. Something was wrong. Paul wasn't acting like himself, and her intuition was screaming at her to be careful. Paul sighed, almost as if he were irritated with the question. "Somewhere you won't be a burden anymore," he said, his voice low and detached. Sandy's heart pounded. The words cut through her like a knife. A burden? Her husband, the man who had once promised to love her in sickness and in health, was now telling her that she was a burden. She couldn't comprehend it. This wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the man who had cared for her during her darkest days in the hospital after the accident. They had fought before, sure, but this felt different. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Something was happening, and Sandy couldn't shake the feeling that it was something terrible. As they reached the edge of a small, isolated ridge, Sandy's heart began to race. There was nothing out here, just endless desert stretching as far as the eye could see. This wasn't a place anyone went for fun. It was desolate and empty. "Paul, what are you doing?" Sandy asked, her voice trembling now. "This isn't a place for—" But Paul wasn't listening. He kept pushing the wheelchair with a sense of urgency, like he was determined to reach some destination that only he knew. Sandy's mind raced, but before she could process the fear swelling inside her, Paul stopped suddenly, turning the wheelchair to face a patch of dry, cracked earth. There was nothing around them, no shelter, no cars, no people. "Paul, what are you doing?" Sandy's voice cracked as she looked up at him, searching his face for some kind of explanation. But he wouldn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, as though he were mentally preparing for something. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "You're not the person I married anymore, Sandy. You're just too much." His words felt like a slap in the face. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be your caretaker, your nurse, your everything. You've changed. You've become a burden." Sandy's stomach twisted. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. This was her husband, the man she had once loved with all her heart, the man who had stood by her through thick and thin. And now he was telling her she was a burden. "Please, Paul, don't do this," she begged, her voice breaking. "I need you." But Paul didn't respond. Instead, he walked around the wheelchair, opening the trunk of the car and removing a large duffel bag. Sandy's heart sank as she realized what was happening. "You can't just leave me here," she whispered, her voice desperate. "I won't survive. Please, Paul, don't do this to me." Paul turned, his face hardening. "I'm doing this for both of us. You won't survive this, but at least you won't be my problem anymore. I'm sorry, Sandy. I really am." And with that, he walked away, leaving her alone in the desert. Sandy's thoughts spiraled. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, praying for a signal, for any sign of help. But there was nothing. No bars. No connection. Just the overwhelming silence of the desert surrounding her. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the land. It was getting colder, but Sandy hardly noticed. The chill in her heart was far colder than the desert air. How could he do this? After everything they had been through, after the accident, the surgeries, the months of recovery, how could he just leave her here to die? She tried to push herself forward in the wheelchair, but the ground was uneven, littered with rocks and thorns. Every attempt was futile. She couldn't move on her own. She had no way of knowing how far the nearest help was. Miles, maybe even hundreds of miles. She couldn't make it on her own. She had nothing. No water, no food, and worst of all, no way of getting back home. The darkness was swallowing her, and with it, the hopelessness. Sandy felt a tear slip down her cheek as she gazed out into the abyss of the desert. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the last few hours, the last few months. Paul had been acting distant for weeks now. At first, it had been small things. Quiet dinners, the lack of affection, the way he would sigh when he had to help her with even the smallest tasks. But this was something else entirely. Had it been building up? Had he been planning this? It didn't make sense. He had always been there for her, even when things were hard. So why would he abandon her now? Sandy closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't let herself lose control. She had to stay calm. She had to survive. But how? How could she survive out here alone with no one to help? What Sandy didn't know was that she wasn't truly alone. In the distance, hidden behind a large rock formation, a pair of eyes watched her every move. Jack Marlowe, a former detective, had been hired to follow Paul for the past few weeks. He had noticed the subtle changes in Paul's behavior, the way he had been distancing himself from Sandy, the lack of concern for her well-being. Jack had been suspicious for some time, and when he saw Paul drive away without Sandy, Jack had known something was wrong. He had been trailing them that afternoon, but from a safe distance. When he saw Paul leave Sandy in the middle of the desert, his instincts kicked in. He knew he couldn't let her be out there alone. Jack's training had prepared him for many things, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. He knew what had to be done. He had to get to Sandy before it was too late. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed his emergency gear from the back of his vehicle and moved quickly toward the area where Sandy was stranded. His heart pounded as he weaved through the rocky terrain, moving swiftly but carefully. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. The cold detachment in Paul's actions, the way he had abandoned Sandy without a second thought. It was beyond comprehension. Jack had no idea who Sandy was beyond the few things Paul had mentioned about her, but what he did know was that she needed help, and Jack was the only one around to give it. As Jack neared the ridge where Sandy had been abandoned, the scene before him felt surreal. The vast desert stretched endlessly, and Sandy sat at the edge of the barren landscape, her wheelchair half buried in sand, her body slumped with exhaustion. The last rays of sunlight bathed the scene in an eerie golden hue, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Jack's heart tightened as he moved closer, careful not to alert Sandy to his presence. He had been tracking Paul for weeks, piecing together the pattern of his increasingly erratic behavior. But nothing could have prepared Jack for what he had just seen. The cold, heartless way Paul had left his wife to fend for herself in a desert wilderness. As Jack drew closer, Sandy's head lifted slightly, her eyes searching the horizon as if she could will someone to appear. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, and her hands were clenched around the arms of the wheelchair, though her fingers were pale from fatigue.
"Hello?"
Sandy's voice echoed across the desert, weak but desperate. "Is anyone out there?" Jack hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure how to approach her, how to explain who he was, or how he had come to be there. But then he reminded himself he couldn't afford to wait. She needed help, and she needed it now. "Hey there," Jack called softly, stepping into the open. Sandy whipped her head toward the sound, her face a mixture of confusion and relief. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "I'm someone who can help," Jack said gently, his voice calm but firm. "Are you all right?" Sandy's expression flickered between disbelief and fear. She blinked rapidly as though she were unsure whether she was seeing things clearly. I don't know. I don't know how I ended up here. My husband, he left me. He just left me to die out here. Jack's jaw clenched. He what? His voice was sharp, almost accusing, but he quickly softened. Listen to me, Sandy. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I'm here to help you. Sandy stared at him for a long moment, her eyes scanning his face. Then, slowly, her shoulders relaxed. Please, she whispered, almost too softly to hear. Please get me out of here. Jack wasted no time. He moved quickly to her side, kneeling beside the wheelchair. Can you stand, Sandy? He asked, his voice low but steady. Sandy shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. No, she whispered, barely able to speak. I can't feel my legs. I can't walk. I've been in this chair for 3 years. All right, Jack said, nodding. I'm going to get you out of here, I promise. He gently lifted her into his arms, cradling her as though she were fragile, though he could feel the strength in her as she clung to him for support. Sandy let out a soft gasp as Jack moved swiftly, carrying her away from the desert's harsh grip. For the first time in hours, Sandy felt a spark of hope flicker in her chest. Maybe she wouldn't die out here after all. Maybe there was a way out. As Jack made his way back to his vehicle with Sandy in his arms, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the desert into near-complete darkness. The cold night air hit them both, and Sandy shivered involuntarily in Jack's arms. She had been through so much already, and the journey was far from over. But now, there was someone by her side, someone who wouldn't leave her behind. Jack was quiet as he walked, his mind racing. He had no idea what kind of person Paul was, but what he had seen that day, how he had abandoned his wife like that, was unforgivable. He had to know more about the situation. He had to make sure that Paul never hurt Sandy again. As they reached the SUV, Jack carefully placed Sandy into the passenger seat, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. He slammed the door shut with a solid thud and quickly moved to the driver's side. The engine roared to life as he began driving away from the ridge, heading back toward the nearest town. Sandy sat silently beside him, her head resting against the headrest, her body exhausted, her mind still trying to process what had happened. She had always been strong, but today had broken her. She felt so small, so helpless. Thank you, she whispered after a long silence. I don't know what I would have done without you. Jack glanced at her for a brief moment before focusing back on the road. You don't have to thank me. I couldn't just leave you out there. No one should ever be treated like that. Sandy nodded, a small tear slipping down her cheek. I don't know how things got like this, she said, her voice barely audible. Paul, he used to love me. He used to care about me. And then, everything changed. I don't know when he stopped seeing me as his wife and started seeing me as a problem. Jack frowned as he focused on the road ahead. Sometimes people change, Sandy, but that doesn't give them the right to treat you like you're less than human. You're not a burden, and you don't deserve to be abandoned. Sandy wiped away the tear, her breath catching in her throat. I used to be so strong. I used to feel like I could do anything. And then after the accident, it was like I lost myself. I thought Paul would be there for me. But now, I don't know. I don't know who I am anymore. Jack's expression softened. You're still the same person. Sandy, the strength that you had before, it's still in you. It might feel buried right now, but it's there, and I'm going to help you find it again. Sandy closed her eyes, absorbing his words. For the first time since the moment Paul left her, she felt something stir deep inside her, a flicker of the woman she used to be. Maybe she wasn't done. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back. The drive back to town was silent, save for the hum of the SUV's engine and the occasional gust of wind. Sandy was lost in thought, her mind racing through the events of the day. Every moment with Paul had been a lie. She couldn't understand how someone who had once promised to love her could abandon her like this. How could he look her in the eye and walk away without a second thought? Jack's voice broke through her thoughts. I've been tracking your husband for a while. Sandy, he said, his tone calm but serious. Something didn't feel right about him. And when I saw him leave you behind like that, I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch. Sandy turned her head toward him, her expression puzzled. You've been tracking Paul? Why? Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He's been acting strange for a while now. I didn't know what was going on, but I suspected he was hiding something. After today, I'm sure of it. He's not the man you think he is. Sandy's heart raced as she processed his words. What do you mean? What do you think he's hiding? Jack glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. I don't have all the details yet, but I think Paul's been hiding something much bigger than just his frustration with your condition. There's more to his behavior than meets the eye, and I think it goes beyond just a failing marriage." Sandy's mind spun. What could Paul possibly be hiding? Was there more to his abandonment than just his impatience with her disability? She wanted answers, and she was determined to get them. Whatever it took, she needed to know the truth. As Jack drove deeper into town, Sandy could feel the weight of the situation settling over her. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it would come to light. But for now, the only thing she could focus on was surviving. Surviving the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the uncertainty of what was to come. Jack had promised to help her, but she would need more than help to rebuild her life. She would need strength, resilience, and a fierce determination to move forward. And she was ready to find it, starting with uncovering the truth about Paul. By the time they reached the small motel on the outskirts of town, the darkness had fully settled in. The lights in the parking lot flickered as Jack parked the SUV and cut the engine. Sandy was exhausted both physically and emotionally, but she knew there was no time to rest. Her mind was racing, and the weight of the unknown hung heavy in the air. Jack turned to her, his face serious. "I've been tracking your husband for a while, but now I think it's time to dig deeper. We need to figure out exactly what's going on with Paul, why he would abandon you like that. You deserve answers." Sandy nodded, her fingers curling tightly around the edge of her seat. "I need answers," she said quietly, her voice tinged with both fear and determination. "I need to know why he did this. I thought I knew him. Jack. But now I'm not sure who he is anymore." Jack leaned back in his seat, glancing at the motel. "The first step is finding out where Paul's been going. He's been acting strange, and I've got a feeling he's hiding something big, something he didn't want you to find out." Sandy shuddered at the thought. What kind of secret could he be keeping? What could be so important that he'd leave me like this? Jack didn't answer right away, his mind working through the possibilities. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but we're going to find out." With a determined look, Jack opened the door and stepped out, moving quickly toward the motel office. Sandy hesitated for a moment before following him. As she wheeled herself into the lobby, she glanced around at the dimly lit room. The desk clerk looked up briefly, his eyes narrow and uninterested, before he returned to his work. "Excuse me," Jack said, his voice firm. "I need to check the records for a man named Paul Wilson. He checked in a few days ago. Can you help me with that?" The clerk barely glanced up, his face indifferent. "We don't give out that kind of information without proper identification," he said gruffly. Jack's eyes hardened. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just trying to track down someone who might be in danger. It's urgent. Can you help me, or not?" The clerk paused, his fingers lingering over the keyboard. Finally he sighed and stood up, walking to the back room. After what seemed like an eternity, he returned with a small stack of papers. "Paul Wilson? Huh? Yeah. He stayed here for a couple of nights, but he checked out this morning. Left early, actually." "Do you know where he went?" Jack asked, his eyes narrowing. The clerk hesitated before replying. "He didn't leave any forwarding address. Just said he was heading to a remote cabin up in the mountains. Didn't seem to want anyone following him." Sandy felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "A cabin in the mountains?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "What's he doing up there? Why didn't he tell me?" Jack turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I think we might have found our next lead. But we're going to need to move fast, whatever Paul's hiding. It's not far from here, and I have a feeling we're getting closer to the truth." The drive to the cabin took over 2 hours, the roads winding through dense trees and rocky terrain. The temperature had dropped significantly since the desert, and Sandy shivered in the passenger seat, though the heater in the car worked steadily. "Do you think we're going to find anything up there?" Sandy asked, her voice quiet but tinged with anxiety. Jack glanced at her, his eyes focused on the road. "I don't know, but I'm hoping we will. Something isn't right about Paul's behavior. I've seen enough to know that he's hiding something, and that something might explain why he left you out there in the desert." Sandy's mind raced as she thought about Paul's increasingly cold behavior. He had been distant for months, yes, but today had been different. He had made the choice to abandon her, to leave her to die in the desert. And now, it seemed that there was more to his actions than just frustration or anger. The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. Was there someone else? Had he been having an affair? Or was it something darker? Was there a secret he didn't want her to find out? She couldn't fathom the possibilities, but she knew one thing for certain. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to stop until she got them. As Jack's vehicle crested a hill, the lights of a small cabin appeared in the distance, nestled between two towering pine trees. The cabin was dark, but there was a faint light coming from the window. It looked abandoned, isolated, a place where someone could hide away from the world. Jack slowed the car, pulling off to the side of the road just before the driveway. He killed the engine, and they both sat in the dark, staring at the cabin. "This is it," Jack said, his voice low. "Let's be careful. We don't know what we're walking into." Sandy nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this was her chance to get the answers she desperately needed. She needed to confront Paul. She needed to know why he had betrayed her. Jack opened his door and stepped out, signaling for Sandy to wait. He crept toward the cabin, moving stealthily. Sandy watched as he approached the front door, testing the handle. It was locked. With a look of frustration, Jack signaled for Sandy to stay put as he moved around the side of the cabin. He returned moments later with a small crowbar. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "We're breaking in. Stay here and don't move." Sandy swallowed hard, trying to calm her racing heart. She trusted Jack, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were escalating. Every moment brought them closer to something she wasn't prepared for. But she had no choice now. The truth was just beyond that door. As the door creaked open under Jack's careful manipulation, they entered the cabin cautiously. The interior was dimly lit, with dust-covered furniture scattered throughout. It looked like a place that had been abandoned for months, maybe even longer. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they stepped further inside. Jack motioned for Sandy to stay close as he checked each room. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Finally, they reached the back room. Jack pushed the door open slowly, and they both froze in place as they saw the contents of the room. It wasn't what either of them had expected. On the far wall, a desk was piled high with papers. Stacks of photographs, old documents, and strange maps covered the surface. But what caught their attention was the file sitting neatly on the edge of the desk. It was labeled with a single word: Sandy. Jack stepped forward, grabbing the file and flipping it open. Inside were photographs of Sandy, some taken during their life together, others taken more recently, when she was in the hospital, during her recovery. There were even photos of her in the wheelchair, taken from a distance. Sandy's breath hitched in her throat. "What is this? Why would he have all this? Why was he following me?" Jack's face was grim as he read through the papers. "He wasn't just your husband, Sandy. He's been involved in something much bigger, something dangerous. This isn't just about you being a burden. This is about something he's been hiding from you for years." Sandy's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just a broken marriage, it was something much darker. Sandy's eyes darted over the photographs and papers that Jack had laid out on the desk. Her hands shook as she reached for a photograph of herself, taken only weeks before the accident. It was a candid shot, one she had never seen before, of her sitting on the balcony of their apartment, gazing out over the city at sunset. The photo seemed innocent enough, but it now felt like a violation. "What is this?" Sandy whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would he keep these pictures of me? Why didn't I notice?" Jack's jaw tightened. He had already pieced together the implications of what he was seeing, but saying the words out loud would make it all the more real. "Paul wasn't just your husband, Sandy. He's been spying on you," Jack said, his voice dark with realization. "This isn't just about your disability. It's much deeper than that." Sandy looked at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Spying? But why? Why would he do that? He loved me. He promised to be there for me. We were a team." Jack sighed deeply, his eyes scanning the documents before him. "This is bigger than just a marriage falling apart. Paul has been involved in something secret, something that's tied to you, your accident, your recovery, everything." Sandy's mind raced as she tried to process Jack's words. She had always trusted Paul, believed in their bond. She thought their life together, though imperfect at times, was strong enough to withstand anything. But now, everything was unraveling, and the threads were pointing to something she couldn't yet understand. "What do you mean it's tied to me?" Sandy's voice cracked. "What does any of this have to do with me? Was it not an accident?" Jack turned to her, his face pale, his hands clenching into fists. "I don't know the full story yet, but I think your accident was no accident. And I think Paul was involved in something much darker than you ever realized. You weren't just in the wrong place at the wrong time, Sandy. I believe your accident was orchestrated. Someone wanted you out of the way." Sandy gasped, her breath catching in her throat. No, that can't be true. My accident was just a random thing. It had nothing to do with anyone. Or did it? Jack ran a hand through his hair, his face tense. "I don't have all the details yet, but I think the reason Paul has been acting so strange is because he's caught up in something dangerous. Maybe it started as an affair, but now I'm certain he's been involved in something much more sinister. These photographs, these documents, they're all part of something he's been hiding from you." Sandy's heart felt like it was going to explode in her chest. Every word Jack said only added weight to the horrifying reality she was beginning to face. Who could possibly want to hurt me? What have I ever done to deserve this? Jack's gaze softened with empathy, but his tone remained firm. "It's not about you, Sandy. It's about what you've unknowingly become involved with. And I think Paul's been trying to protect you by keeping you in the dark. But whatever it is, it's not going away. We need to uncover the truth, and we need to do it fast." Sandy took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The world around her felt like it was shifting under her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her relationship with Paul, was crumbling before her eyes. "I need to know what happened, Jack," Sandy said, her voice stronger now, though the fear was still there. "I need to know why Paul did this and what's been going on. I can't live with this uncertainty anymore. I won't." Jack nodded, determination in his eyes. "We'll find out. We're close, Sandy, very close. But we have to be careful. Whoever Paul is involved with isn't playing around. This isn't just about you and Paul anymore, it's bigger than that." Jack and Sandy spent the next few hours combing through the documents and photographs, trying to piece together what Paul had been hiding. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the papers rustling as they flipped through them. In the corner of the room, a file with a familiar name caught Sandy's eye. It was a thick, manila folder with a name scrawled across the front, Sandy Wilson. "That's my name," she murmured, her fingers trembling as she opened the folder. Inside, there were records of medical treatments, police reports, and legal documents, papers detailing every aspect of her life post-accident. There were notes on her recovery, her therapy sessions, and even her interactions with doctors. But the most unsettling thing was a section near the back of the folder marked Insurance Policy. Sandy felt her stomach twist as she flipped through the pages. She had always trusted Paul to handle the finances, but seeing the sheer volume of documents surrounding her life, her every movement, her every interaction, felt like an invasion. "Why would Paul keep all of this?" she whispered, a chill running down her spine. Jack looked over her shoulder, his face darkening as he read the documents. "It's not just that he's been keeping tabs on you, Sandy," Jack said, his voice low. "He's been tracking your recovery every step of the way. He's been making sure that no one can get in his way. And if you didn't know this, then there's a reason." Sandy's mind reeled. What was Jack saying? Had Paul been planning something all along? "What are you trying to say?" "Jack," Sandy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That my accident was a setup." Jack hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking back to the folder. "I think your accident was part of a larger plan, Sandy. And Paul has been at the center of it. This isn't just about you, it's about money and power and people with very dangerous interests. The question now is why you? Why were you the target?" Sandy felt a lump rise in her throat. She had trusted Paul with everything. He had been her partner, her caregiver, her love. And now, everything she knew about him felt like a lie. "Paul knew all of this was happening," Jack continued. "He was involved, but he kept you in the dark, so you wouldn't ask questions. And now, I think it's time we find out exactly who he's been working with and what they want." The sun had begun to rise by the time Jack and Sandy left the cabin. The quiet, tense night had passed without any further surprises, but Sandy couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that everything was about to change. They had gathered enough information to begin tracking Paul's whereabouts, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. But there was one question that loomed larger than all the rest. Why? As Jack drove them back into town, Sandy couldn't stop thinking about the records they had found. Her name, her medical history, her every move, all documented, all catalogued like she was some sort of commodity. What did Paul know that she didn't? "We need to meet someone who knows more about Paul," Jack said, breaking into her thoughts. "Someone who can help us understand exactly who we're dealing with." Sandy nodded, feeling a surge of determination. She couldn't let Paul get away with this, not when her life was on the line. "Who do you have in mind?" Sandy asked, her voice steady now. Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "I know a man named Marcus. He used to work with Paul. If there's anyone who knows the truth about what's really going on, it's him." The air was thick with tension as Jack drove through the quiet streets of town, the SUV's headlights cutting through the darkness. Sandy sat silently in the passenger seat, her mind whirling with the knowledge she had just uncovered. Paul's secrets, his betrayal, everything was coming into focus, but with each new revelation the questions multiplied. "Do you trust this Marcus guy?" Sandy asked, her voice breaking the silence. "What makes you think he'll help us?" Jack's grip on the wheel tightened as he navigated the winding roads. "I don't know if I trust him, but right now he's our best shot. Marcus worked with Paul for years. He knows the ins and outs of everything Paul's been involved in. If anyone can shed light on what's going on, it's him." Sandy nodded, but the knot in her stomach remained. She had no idea who this Marcus person was, but if Jack was right, he might be the key to unlocking the full truth about Paul's dark secrets. She just had to hope they weren't walking into another trap. As they pulled up to a small, nondescript building on the edge of town, Jack killed the engine. The place looked like any other run-down office. A faded sign on the door, a few cracked windows, and no lights on inside. It felt abandoned, yet something about it made Sandy uneasy. This wasn't the kind of place anyone would willingly walk into unless they were desperate. "Stay close," Jack murmured, his eyes scanning the surroundings before he opened the door and led Sandy inside. The building was dark and smelled of stale air, the kind of place that felt like it had seen better days. There was a front desk with a dusty lamp, but no receptionist, only the faint sound of something moving in the back room. Jack knocked on the door, his hand steady but firm. "Marcus, it's Jack. I need to talk to you." There was a moment of silence before the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked as though he had been through his fair share of battles, both physical and mental. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and calculating, but there was a weariness to him that made him look older than he probably was. "What's this about, Jack?" Marcus asked, his voice low and gravelly. He glanced at Sandy for a moment, then back at Jack. "I didn't think I'd be seeing you again. Not after everything that went down." Sandy's heart began to race, unsure of what she was walking into. She had heard so many things about Paul's life, but nothing about this man. She didn't know who he was or how he fit into all of this, but she could tell by the way he sized her up that he was no stranger to secrets. "Long story," Jack said, stepping inside the room and motioning for Sandy to follow. "We need information about Paul. We think he's involved in something much bigger than we realized, and we need to know everything." Marcus leaned against the wall, folding his arms across his chest. "Paul's been playing a dangerous game for a while now," he said, his tone heavy. "He's not who you think he is. None of this started with your accident, Sandy. This goes back much further than that." Sandy's breath hitched in her chest. "What do you mean? What is he involved in?" Marcus met her gaze, his eyes intense. "Paul's always been about control, but it's more than that. He's been involved with a group that deals in some very illegal things." "And your accident?" "That wasn't just an accident. It was orchestrated. He wanted you out of the way." Sandy staggered backward, her mind reeling. "You're telling me my accident wasn't a mistake? Paul planned it?" Marcus nodded slowly. "He didn't plan it the way you think, but yeah. He needed you out of the picture. You were the last thing standing between him and something much bigger, and you're still in the way." Sandy felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What are you saying? What could Paul possibly be involved in that would make him want to hurt me?" Jack stepped forward, his voice steady but urgent. "Marcus, we don't have much time. You need to tell us everything you know. This isn't just about Paul anymore. If he's involved with the wrong people, we're all in danger." Marcus's eyes flickered to the door, then back to Sandy. "You're right. You don't have much time. Paul's not just some businessman playing with his future. He's been working with people who have their hands in everything. Illegal drugs, smuggling, arms dealing, you name it. And it all leads back to one thing: money, power, and control." Sandy's pulse raced as she processed Marcus's words. She had never imagined that Paul, her husband, the man she had trusted with her life, could be involved in something like this. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. His coldness, his secrecy, the way he had kept her in the dark. You said this goes back further, Jack prompted. How far back? How long has Paul been involved with these people? Marcus's face darkened as he glanced at the floor. Longer than you think. He's been involved for years. He's worked with people in high places. And now he's in too deep. He's not the man you thought he was. He never was. Sandy's chest tightened as Marcus's words sunk in. She had always trusted Paul. She had believed in their life together, their future. And now, all of it was crumbling before her eyes. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why me? Why did he want me out of the way?" Marcus met her gaze with a look of pity in his eyes. "Because you were too good for him. You were his anchor, Sandy. You were the one thing keeping him from going all the way. He didn't want anyone to stop him, and you were in his way." Sandy took a step back, her thoughts swirling. Everything she thought she knew about her life was a lie. And the man she had married, the man she had loved, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. "How do we stop him?" she asked, her voice trembling but fierce. Marcus's eyes softened. "The first step is making sure Paul can't get to you. He'll come after you, Sandy. He'll do anything to finish what he started. We need to make sure he doesn't have a chance to hurt you again." Jack's jaw clenched. "We'll take care of him. But we need your help, Marcus. We need to know who else is involved and where they're hiding." Marcus sighed, rubbing his forehead. "It's not going to be easy. But if you're serious about taking him down, I'll help. But you have to be prepared for what's coming. Once we go down this road, there's no turning back." Sandy's hands shook as she wiped away a tear. She had come so far. From the hospital to the desert to the truth, and now here she was, facing the full weight of what Paul had done. But there was still so much more to uncover. So much more at stake. "I'm ready," Sandy said quietly, her voice steady. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make sure Paul never hurts me again." Jack glanced at her, his eyes filled with admiration. "We'll do this together, Sandy. I won't let you face this alone." Marcus looked between them, nodding slowly. "All right then, let's take him down." The night was nearly silent as they left Marcus's office, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Sandy's mind buzzed, trying to process everything she had just learned. Paul was no longer the man she had loved, the man she had trusted. He was part of something far more sinister, and he had planned her accident all along. Everything that had happened, the betrayal, the isolation, the feeling of being discarded, had been part of a plan she had never seen coming. Jack led her back to the car, his face grim, but there was a resolve in his eyes. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," he said, his voice low and steady. "But we're getting closer, Sandy. Marcus might not know everything, but he's given us the push we needed to find out the rest." Sandy's heart was heavy with questions, but one stood out above the others. "Do you think we can stop him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack opened the car door for her, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "I don't know, but we can try. We've got to figure out where Paul is hiding and who he's working with. If we don't do this, he'll keep coming after you, and I won't let that happen." Sandy nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had never felt more alone than she did right now, but Jack's determination gave her hope. She had to believe that they could make this right. "Then we do it," she said, her voice firm. "We take him down. We end this." The first thing they needed was information. The more they could learn about the people Paul was involved with, the better their chances of stopping him. Marcus had given them a name, Victor Lawson. A shadowy figure in the criminal underworld, Lawson was someone Paul had been working with for years, someone who had the power and resources to make things disappear. If they could find him, they could learn everything they needed to know about the operation Paul had gotten himself wrapped up in. Jack didn't waste any time. He made a few calls, his connections in the underworld helpful but guarded. They had to move carefully. Any wrong step, and they'd alert Paul's associates, and that could be deadly. "I've got a lead," Jack said, his voice sharp as he hung up the phone. "Victor Lawson's been seen at a warehouse on the edge of town. It's a good starting point." Sandy took a deep breath, her heart racing. "What happens when we find him?" she asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "We don't confront him yet," Jack replied, his expression unreadable. "We gather information, figure out who else is involved, and then we take it from there. We can't afford to make mistakes, Sandy." They drove to the warehouse, the journey long and quiet. Sandy's mind kept replaying the same question. What had Paul gotten into? Was he really in over his head? Or was he doing this for his own gain? And if Paul had been working with people like Lawson, what did that mean for their future? The warehouse came into view, a large rundown building tucked away in a quiet industrial area. It was dark, except for a few dim lights flickering inside. No signs of life outside. But Sandy had a feeling things weren't as quiet as they seemed. Jack parked the car a few blocks away, and they approached the warehouse on foot, sticking to the shadows. Sandy's heart pounded in her chest as they neared the building. This was it. This was the moment they'd been preparing for. As they got closer, they heard voices from inside. Low murmurs, indistinct but unmistakably male. Jack motioned for Sandy to stay behind him, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the warehouse. "Stay close, Sandy," Jack whispered. "If things go south, we need to get out of here fast." Sandy nodded, her grip tight on the edge of her wheelchair. She was terrified, but she wasn't going to let Paul, let anyone win. She had come this far, and she wasn't backing down now. The closer they got to the entrance, the clearer the voices became. It sounded like a meeting, men speaking in hushed tones, as if they didn't want to be overheard. Jack peered through a crack in the door, then looked back at Sandy, his expression tense. "I see Lawson," Jack muttered, his voice low. "But there are more people in there. We can't go in guns blazing. Not yet. We need to wait for the right moment." Sandy's stomach churned as she pressed herself into the shadows, trying to stay hidden from view. Every instinct told her to run, to turn back, but she knew she couldn't. She had to know the truth. She had to make sure Paul wouldn't hurt her again. Jack motioned for Sandy to follow him as he carefully moved along the side of the building, looking for another way inside. They found a small side door that had been left slightly ajar, the faint sound of voices drifting from within. As they slipped inside, the dim light of the warehouse illuminated rows of crates and boxes. They were in the far corner of the building, just out of sight of the main group gathered near the center. Sandy's pulse quickened as they slowly crept toward the voices. "Paul's not here," one of the men said, his tone sharp. "He's the one who knows how to get the goods across the border. Without him, we're stuck." "Maybe we can find another way," another man suggested. "But Paul's been unreliable lately. We can't keep depending on him." Sandy's breath caught in her throat as she heard their words. Unreliable. Paul had been working with these people who were smuggling goods and what? Weapons? Drugs? She hadn't known the details before, but now it was starting to make sense. "That's why we've been tracking his movements," the first man said, his voice growing frustrated. "He's been getting careless. If he's not careful, we'll have to take care of him ourselves." Sandy's heart stopped. They were talking about killing Paul. Jack grabbed her arm gently, pulling her back further into the shadows. His grip was firm, but his face was pale with the gravity of the situation. "We need to get out of here, now." But before they could retreat, the door to the warehouse creaked open, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the building. Sandy's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Jack's eyes widened as he pulled Sandy into an even darker corner of the room, the two of them huddling in silence, praying they wouldn't be noticed. The footsteps grew louder, and Sandy's anxiety rose to a fever pitch. Jack whispered urgently, "Stay quiet. We need to get out, and we need to get out now." Sandy's mind raced. Everything she'd been holding in was threatening to spill over: fear, anger, betrayal. But she stayed still, listening to the men talk as they passed by. She could feel Jack's breath steadying, his presence a solid anchor as the seconds ticked by. Finally, when the footsteps faded, Jack moved first, signaling for Sandy to follow. Slowly they slipped out of the dark corner, back toward the side door. The night air hit them like a cold slap as they emerged back outside. Sandy looked at Jack, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to tell the police. They have to stop Paul." Jack shook his head. "We can't. If we involve the police now, Paul and his associates will be ready. We have to take him down ourselves quietly." Sandy nodded, her pulse racing. This was it, the moment when everything would change, the moment when she had to make a choice, keep running from the truth or fight back. "I'm ready," she said, her voice low but steady. "Let's end this." Jack's expression softened, and he gave her a small nod. "We will. I won't let him hurt you again." The next few days passed in a blur for Sandy. Every waking moment felt like a step closer to uncovering the truth, and yet every step felt like a march into the unknown. She couldn't shake the images of the men in the warehouse, talking so casually about Paul's life, his actions, his potential death. It was as though Paul had become a pawn in a much larger game. But she was still struggling to understand just how deep the web went and how much danger she was in now. Jack had been doing everything he could to track down the people who were involved with Paul. They had to move quickly. If they didn't, the trail would go cold and Paul's allies would make their move. But even though Jack was doing everything in his power to protect her, Sandy knew that they couldn't keep hiding forever. They were playing with fire now, and at some point they'd have to confront the truth head-on. Sandy sat in the small, cramped motel room Jack had rented for them, staring at the map Jack had spread out on the table. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. It had been a long time since she had felt in control of her life, and now she had a purpose, she had a mission. But the fear was still there. "What's next?" she asked, breaking the silence. She was tired of waiting, tired of hiding. Jack glanced up from his phone, his face serious. "We find Paul. We take him down. We have to go to the heart of this. There's no turning back now." Sandy nodded, her jaw tightening. "I'm ready. I'm done being afraid. We need to make him pay for everything he's done." Jack sighed and looked at her, his eyes softening for just a moment. "I'm with you, Sandy. But we have to be smart about this. We can't rush in blind. Rush in. Paul's not the only one we're up against." The sound of a knock at the door interrupted them, and Jack immediately tensed, his eyes narrowing. Sandy felt the same instinctual reaction, a wave of suspicion washing over her. Was someone onto them? Was this the moment they'd been dreading? Jack stood up, his body tense with readiness. He slowly approached the door and peeked through the small peephole, his face unreadable. After a long moment, he exhaled and opened the door to reveal Marcus, the man who had given them their first lead. "Marcus," Jack greeted him with a curt nod. "What are you doing here?" Marcus looked over his shoulder, ensuring no one else was in sight before stepping inside. He was carrying a small, folded-up piece of paper. "I've got something you need to see," he said, his voice low. "It's about Paul." Sandy immediately felt the surge of anticipation. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight. Marcus unfolded the paper and handed it to Jack, who scanned the contents quickly. His brow furrowed. "This is it. This is the missing piece." Sandy stepped closer, peering over Jack's shoulder. The paper was a map, with various locations marked in red. One of the markings was labeled with Paul's name. "Where is this?" Sandy asked, pointing to the location. Marcus answered, "That's where he's hiding. I've been keeping an eye on his movements. He's been using that place as a hideout for months now. It's a remote cabin, far from here in the mountains. But it's heavily guarded. If you're going there, you need to be prepared." Jack looked at Sandy, his gaze steady. "This is it. If we want to put an end to this, we go now." Sandy hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. The stakes had never been higher. She could feel the weight of everything they had uncovered, and now it was all leading up to this, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The fear of what Paul could do was nothing compared to the strength that was building inside her. "Let's go," she said firmly, her voice steady. The drive to the cabin felt like the longest journey of Sandy's life. As they drove through the winding mountain roads, the trees grew denser and the air grew thinner. Sandy's hands clenched the armrests of her wheelchair as she glanced out the window, watching the dark shapes of trees pass by. They were getting closer, and with each passing mile her heart raced faster. Jack drove in silence, his focus unwavering as he navigated the treacherous road. Marcus sat in the back, his gaze occasionally flicking between them. There was no need for words. Everyone knew what was at stake now. The cabin came into view after what seemed like an eternity. It was hidden in a small clearing surrounded by trees, its dark outline barely visible against the backdrop of the night. The lights inside were dim, casting faint shadows through the windows. Jack pulled the car to a stop a few hundred yards away, keeping them out of view. They would need to move carefully from here on out. "This is it," Jack said, turning to face Sandy. "We go in quietly. No mistakes. We can't risk alerting Paul or his associates." Sandy nodded, her expression determined. "Let's end this." They exited the car slowly, making their way toward the cabin, staying low and using the cover of the trees to their advantage. As they approached, They could see figures moving through the windows, guards, no doubt. Paul wasn't going to let anyone get close without a fight. Jack signaled for them to stop, his hand raised. "We'll need to take them out quietly, one by one. Marcus, you stay behind me. Sandy, stay low and move when I say." Sandy's heart pounded in her chest, but she felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was it. She was no longer the woman Paul had abandoned in the desert. She was taking control of her life, and she wasn't going to stop until she had the answers she needed. They moved forward with purpose, each step measured. Jack had always been calm under pressure, but now there was an urgency in his movements, a sense of finality. They were on the verge of uncovering everything, of confronting Paul and the darkness he had become involved in. When they reached the side of the cabin, Jack took a deep breath, signaling Marcus to stay behind him. "You're with me," Jack said to Sandy. "We'll take the back door." They moved quickly, reaching the back of the cabin. Jack carefully checked the door. It was locked, but that was nothing Jack couldn't handle. He pulled out a small tool, quickly picking the lock. With a soft click, the door opened, and they slipped inside, the musty air of the cabin hitting them. The sounds of muffled voices came from the next room, along with the faint clinking of glass. They were close, too close. Sandy's pulse was deafening in her ears as they crept down the dark hallway. There, at the end, was a faint glow of light coming from a cracked door. Paul's voice was low, speaking with someone she didn't recognize. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered. "We move fast. We get what we need and we leave." Sandy nodded, her hands clenched into fists as she braced herself for the confrontation ahead. The truth, the betrayal, the life she thought she knew, everything was about to come crashing down. They reached the doorway, and Jack motioned for Sandy to stay behind him as he pushed the door open, just enough to peek inside. What they saw made Sandy's blood run cold. Paul was sitting at a table, his back to them, talking to a man who appeared to be the leader of the operation. The man's face was unfamiliar, but his presence was commanding, and his cold demeanor sent a shiver down Sandy's spine. "I need to finish this," Paul was saying, his voice low but firm. "Once I deal with her, we can move on. We have everything we need." Sandy felt her breath catch. "Her?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack's grip tightened on the door. "He's talking about you." Sandy's eyes went wide, her heart racing. The anger, the betrayal, it all rushed to the surface. Paul wasn't just trying to escape his marriage. He was planning to kill her. He was planning to have her erased from his life, all to protect his secrets. Jack took a deep breath, pushing the door open slowly. "It's over, Paul," he said, his voice steady but full of resolve. The moment Paul turned around, his eyes went wide with shock. "Jack, what the hell are you doing here?" Before Paul could react further, Jack lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar. "You're done, Paul. You're not going to hurt her anymore." Sandy stepped into the room, her voice low but powerful. "You lied to me. You used me, and now you'll pay for it." The cabin was eerily silent now, the tension thick in the air as Paul stared at Jack with disbelief. His hands trembled slightly, the shock evident in his eyes. The man he had once called his partner was standing in front of him, and the woman he had betrayed was staring at him with fury in her eyes. There was nowhere to run. Jack's grip on Paul's collar tightened. "You've been hiding behind lies, Paul. You've been using her for years, manipulating her, and now we're done." His voice was calm, but it held a dangerous edge. Sandy stood in the doorway watching Paul. Her breath was shallow, her heart racing, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She had been through so much, abandoned, betrayed, discarded, and now she was standing here facing the man who had broken her. "You think you can just walk away from everything you've done?" Sandy's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "You ruined my life, Paul. You took everything from me, and now I'm taking it back." Paul's eyes darted between Sandy and Jack, his mind clearly racing. "You don't understand. I had no choice," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I did what I had to do to survive. I didn't want any of this. You think I wanted this? I didn't. You don't know what it's like, the people I had to work with." "You don't get to make excuses anymore," Sandy interrupted, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "You chose this. You chose to hurt me, and now I'm done. You've taken enough from me." Sandy stepped forward, her gaze unflinching. "I trusted you. I loved you. Paul, I thought we could make it through anything. And then you betrayed me. I'm not your victim anymore." Paul's face twisted in frustration and anger, and for a split second it looked like he might lash out. But Jack stepped in front of Sandy, his stance firm, his eyes locked onto Paul's. "You don't get to hurt her again," Jack said, his voice steady. "We're taking you down, Paul. It's over." The room seemed to close in around them, the dim light flickering from a single bulb above, casting long shadows across the floor. Paul's face grew darker, his frustration palpable. He took a step back as if considering his next move. "Do you think this is it?" Paul sneered, his voice suddenly cold and dangerous. "You think you've won? There's more at play here than you realize. Sandy, you don't know who you're dealing with." Sandy's stomach twisted as a chill ran down her spine. "What do you mean? What's going on, Paul? Who else is involved?" Paul let out a bitter laugh. "You've been asking the wrong questions all this time. It's not just about me. There are people, powerful people, who will come after you once they realize what's happening. You think you're safe? You're not. You've already made a dangerous enemy." Sandy stepped closer to him, her voice cold. "I don't care who you've been working with, Paul. You're not getting away with this. Not anymore." Jack's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his hand tightening around the handle of the gun he had drawn. "You're not walking out of here. Paul, we're done with your lies." The tension in the room was suffocating, but the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Someone else was coming, someone who didn't want their plans interrupted. The door to the cabin suddenly burst open, and two armed men rushed inside, their guns drawn. Jack and Sandy froze as the intruders scanned the room, their eyes locking onto the three of them immediately. Sandy's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected them to show up so soon. "Get down!" Jack yelled, pushing Sandy behind him as he took cover behind an overturned table. The men moved quickly, their eyes scanning the room, clearly prepared for a confrontation. One of the men sneered at Paul. "You were supposed to take care of this, Paul," he said, his voice dark and menacing. "You're a liability now." Sandy's pulse raced as she pressed herself against the floor, trying to stay out of sight. She could feel her breath quicken, her mind spiraling. Was this it? Was this the end of everything? These men were here to finish what Paul had started, to clean up the mess. Paul, visibly shaken, stood up from his position by the table. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just trying to get out. I didn't know she'd..." He stammered, his words faltering. "You think we care about your excuses?" the second man barked. "This isn't personal, Paul. You're expendable. All of you are." Jack, keeping a cool head despite the chaos, grabbed Sandy's hand and pulled her closer to the corner of the room. "We need to get out of here, now," he whispered urgently. "Stay low." But before they could make a move, the men's eyes locked onto Jack and Sandy. One of them lifted his gun. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold. Sandy's heart raced. They were trapped. Just as the man raised his weapon to take aim at Jack, there was a sudden explosion of noise, a loud bang that echoed through the cabin. The lights flickered, and in the midst of the confusion, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Marcus. "Don't move!" Marcus shouted, a gun in his hand, his eyes cold and focused. The two men immediately froze, their attention diverted to him. Marcus moved swiftly, stepping forward with authority. "You're not taking them. Not on my watch." Sandy's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't expected Marcus to show up like this. But now, in the middle of the chaos, he was their lifeline. Marcus, with cold precision, leveled his gun at one of the armed men and shot him in the leg. The man crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. His companion immediately dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Get out of here," Marcus ordered. "I'm not asking twice." The remaining man hesitated for a moment before bolting for the door, dragging his injured companion behind him. Sandy could hardly believe what she was witnessing. It was happening so quickly, the danger so real. The cabin, once a place of betrayal and secrets, had now become the battleground for their survival. Jack, still tense, helped Sandy to her feet. "We need to go now," he said, pulling her toward the exit. Marcus turned to them, his eyes softening just for a moment. "You're not safe here. Not for long. Paul's people will be back. They won't stop until they have what they want. You need to get out of town. Lay low." Sandy nodded, her heart still pounding. "What about Paul?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear. Marcus's expression darkened. "We deal with him later. Right now, we get you to safety." With the immediate danger behind them, Jack, Sandy and Marcus made their way out of the cabin and into the cold night air. The SUV was parked a short distance away, and they wasted no time getting in. Marcus took the wheel this time, driving them away from the cabin further into the night. As they drove, Sandy's thoughts raced. They had just narrowly escaped death, but they still hadn't confronted Paul, hadn't gotten the answers they needed. There was still so much left to uncover. Paul had been involved with far more than she could have ever imagined, and now the real battle was just beginning. "Where are we going?" Sandy asked, her voice calm but filled with anticipation. Marcus glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes serious. "We're getting you somewhere safe. After that, we find Paul, and we make sure he can't hurt you anymore." The night felt endless as the SUV sped down the winding roads, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with tension, and Sandy could feel every muscle in her body tight with anticipation. They had barely escaped the cabin with their lives, but there was no time to rest. Paul was still out there, and his associates were likely still hunting for them. But now, with Marcus by their side, they had a plan. Sandy glanced over at Jack, whose expression was hard as stone. He had been calm in the face of danger, guiding her through everything with a steady hand, but even he couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. They knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Where are we going?" "Marcus," Jack finally asked, breaking the silence. "We need a safe place, a real one. Paul's people will be coming for us, and we don't have much time." Marcus's jaw tightened as he glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "There's a place I know, a secluded spot in the hills, far from town. We can lay low there for a bit and figure out our next move." Sandy nodded, relieved that they had some time to regroup. "How long will we have before they realize we're gone?" "Not long," Marcus replied, his voice grim. "Paul has eyes everywhere. But if we're lucky, he won't be expecting us to go that far out of town. We'll have a little bit of breathing room." As they drove further into the hills, the landscape became more isolated, the world around them quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. Sandy's thoughts drifted back to the cabin, what they had uncovered, what they had barely escaped. Paul wasn't just a man caught in a bad situation. He was a criminal, someone who had made deals with people who could ruin entire lives without blinking. Sandy had been part of his world for years, and she hadn't even known it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had loved him, she had trusted him, and he had used her. But now, she had a chance to make things right. Not just for herself, but for everyone Paul had wronged. And she was ready to face whatever came next. They reached the cabin Marcus had mentioned in less than an hour. It was tucked away in the hills, hidden from view by a thicket of trees. The place looked as abandoned as any safe house should. A small, single-story structure with a weathered roof and overgrown vines creeping up its walls. It had clearly seen better days, but it was safe. For now, it was home. As soon as Marcus parked the SUV, Jack quickly checked the perimeter. The cabin was off the grid, making it difficult to track, but Jack wasn't taking any chances. They couldn't afford to be found. "This will do," Jack said, his voice low. "We'll lay low here until we figure out our next move." Sandy stepped out of the car, her legs weak but steady as she wheeled herself into the cabin. The interior was basic, furnishings covered in dust, a dim light flickering overhead, and a faint smell of stale wood. It wasn't much, but it was a place to regroup. They settled in quickly, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards as they moved about. Marcus checked the cabin's few windows and locked the door behind them, making sure they were secure. "Okay," Marcus said, taking a seat at the small wooden table. "We have a few hours before anyone realizes we're here. We need to figure out what's next." Sandy sat down, her mind still racing. She looked at Jack, who had been scanning his phone for any news, but it seemed like they were still in the clear for now. "I don't know how much longer we can stay hidden," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos she felt inside. "Paul won't just let us go, and after what we saw, I'm sure his people will be looking for us." "We're not running anymore," Jack said, his voice calm but resolute. "We're finishing this. We take him down, once and for all." Sandy's heart pounded as the weight of his words settled over her. She knew they had no choice. They couldn't keep running. They had to confront Paul and face him. and make him answer for everything he'd done to her, to them.
"We need to go after him,"
Sandy said, her voice unwavering now. "We need to expose everything he's been involved in, all of it." Jack nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "That's the plan. But we need to be smart. We can't just charge in there. We have to hit him where it hurts, take away everything he's worked for." Marcus looked between them, his gaze hardening. "You're right, and we don't have much time. But before we do anything, we need to know everything about his connections. We need to make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next." Over the next few hours, they devised a plan. They couldn't rely on law enforcement, not yet. Paul's influence was too widespread, and they knew it would take too long to get the authorities involved without risking their lives. They had to handle this themselves, carefully and methodically. Sandy was silent for most of the planning, her thoughts still clouded with the fear of what might happen when they confronted Paul. But she had come too far to back down now. She had to see this through. Jack spread out a map of the region, pointing to the location where Paul's hideout was, and the various properties that had been marked on the list they found in the cabin. "This is the heart of his operation," Jack said, his finger tracing the lines. "We take out his resources, destroy his supply lines, and make sure he knows we're coming for him. If we do it right, he won't have anywhere to run." Sandy looked at the map, her mind racing with possibilities. "What about his people, the ones he's been working with?" she asked. "How do we deal with them?" Marcus answered. "We take them out first. They're the ones with the power, the ones who are keeping him afloat. Without them, he's nothing." Jack gave a nod of agreement. "We hit them fast and hard before they can alert Paul. Then we move in." Sandy closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. They were so close. She could feel it. They were about to finish what Paul had started. The next morning they set their plan into motion. Jack and Marcus had tracked down one of Paul's associates who had been dealing in stolen goods, and they planned to ambush him before he could get word to Paul. Sandy, despite her limitations, was determined to play her part. She knew she couldn't go into the lion's den herself, but she would do everything she could from behind the scenes. The operation started with a single phone call, Jack posing as someone from a rival criminal organization, offering to buy Paul's assets. The associate, eager for the opportunity, agreed to meet. As Jack, Marcus, and Sandy prepared for the confrontation, Sandy felt a chill run through her. This was it. There was no turning back now. They drove to the meeting place, a small, secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. The location was a prime target, one where Paul's operations had been running under the radar for months. As they approached the building, Jack's nerves were tight, but his eyes were focused. "This is it," he said, looking back at Sandy one last time. "Stay sharp." Sandy took a deep breath, gripping the seat of her wheelchair tightly. "I'm ready," she said, her voice strong. They moved in. Jack and Marcus took the front of the warehouse while Sandy remained in the car, monitoring the situation, but the moment they entered, things went wrong. A gunshot rang out from inside the building. Sandy's heart stopped. She heard shouting, followed by more gunfire. "Jack!" she screamed, her voice filled with terror. Sandy's heart pounded in her chest as she heard the gunshot echo through the warehouse. The familiar feeling of dread gripped her, and before she could think, her hand was already reaching for the car door. She couldn't stay back. Not anymore. "Stay in the car, Sandy!" Jack's voice cracked through her panic over the radio, the urgency clear. But Sandy couldn't just sit there. Not when they were in danger. Not when Jack was in danger. She had to help. She slammed the door open and pushed her wheelchair as fast as she could toward the entrance, her mind focused on one thing, getting to Jack. The sound of shuffling and shouting grew louder as she approached the warehouse. She could hear voices, some muffled, others sharper. She didn't know how close Jack was to the gunfire, but she could feel her heart racing faster with every step. Inside, chaos reigned. Jack and Marcus were crouched behind crates exchanging fire with Paul's men. Sandy could hear the harsh crack of gunfire and the panicked shouts of men scrambling to cover. But then she heard a voice she never expected, Paul's. "You're both too late," Paul shouted, his voice ragged with anger. "You don't get to take my life from me, Sandy. You don't understand what you've done! This is bigger than you." Sandy's breath hitched. Bigger than me? What did that even mean? She wheeled herself closer, trying to stay hidden behind the large metal beams and crates, straining to listen. She could hear the sound of footsteps drawing near, and her eyes darted toward the entrance. That's when she saw him. Paul. He appeared from behind a stack of crates, his face twisted with anger and fear, his eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. "You!" he spat, his voice filled with hatred. "You think you've won? You think you can just walk away from this?" Sandy's chest tightened, the shock of seeing him so close overwhelming her. Her pulse was racing, but she refused to let fear take hold. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment she had prepared for. "I'm not running any more, Paul," Sandy said, her voice shaking but determined. "You can't control me anymore. You never could." Paul's eyes narrowed, his hands shaking as he reached for the gun at his waist. "You'll regret this, Sandy. You'll all regret this." Before Sandy could respond, the sound of footsteps approaching interrupted them. She looked over her shoulder to see two of Paul's men rounding the corner. They had their guns raised, but Marcus was already firing back. The tension snapped. Jack moved from his cover, quickly taking out one of the men with a precise shot. The other dropped to the floor, disarmed. In the chaos of the gunfire, Paul turned to run. But Sandy wasn't about to let him get away. As Paul sprinted for the back exit, Sandy pushed her wheelchair forward as quickly as she could. Her heart was pounding in her ears, but her mind was clear. She couldn't let Paul escape. Not again. Not after everything he had done to her. To them. "Jack, Marcus, get him!" Sandy shouted, her voice raw with urgency. She was close enough now to see the panic in Paul's eyes as he made his way toward the back door of the warehouse. The escape was within his reach, but not if she could help it. Paul reached the door, fumbling for the handle, his breath ragged with fear. Just as he opened it, Jack and Marcus moved in behind him, cutting off his route. "Don't make this worse for yourself, Paul," Jack said coldly, his gun aimed at Paul. "You're done. You can't run anymore." Paul's eyes darted between Jack and Sandy, his fear palpable. He wasn't used to being cornered like this. For the first time, he looked truly vulnerable. "I didn't want it to come to this," Paul muttered, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "I was just trying to survive. All I wanted was to get out of this mess." Sandy's grip tightened around the arms of her wheelchair. "You're a coward, Paul. You abandoned me. You left me to die in the desert. You think I care about your excuses?" Tears welled up in her eyes as the anger coursed through her. "You've hurt me in ways I can never fix, but you won't hurt anyone else again." As Paul took a step back, Jack moved forward, keeping his gun trained on him. "It's over, Paul. You've run out of chances." For a moment there was silence, the kind of silence that felt suffocating. Then, Paul's shoulders slumped as he realized the game was up. There was nowhere to run, no one left to deceive. Paul stood still for a moment, his face twisted in defeat. Then, with a deep sigh, he lowered his head, his voice suddenly quiet and resigned. All right, I'll tell you everything," Paul said, his voice weak. "But you have to understand, I never meant for it to go this far." Jack took a cautious step forward, lowering his gun slightly. Sandy remained still, watching Paul carefully, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and relief. "What do you mean, Paul?" Sandy asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "What's been going on? Why did you do it?" Paul ran a hand through his hair, his eyes empty. "I got in too deep. I met the wrong people and everything spiraled out of control. They offered me something I couldn't refuse. Money, power, influence. But I didn't want you to get hurt. I didn't want you involved, so I kept you in the dark." Sandy felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. "You kept me in the dark? You kept me locked away in that house, manipulated me, left me in the desert, and you think you didn't want me involved? You don't get to make excuses anymore, Paul." Paul winced at her words but didn't argue. He knew there was no way out. "I was going to leave," he continued, his voice quieter now. "But they wouldn't let me. I thought I could run away from it all. But they kept finding me, and they knew if I didn't, they'd come for you, for both of us." Sandy took a slow, steadying breath, the weight of his words sinking in. "So you put my life in danger just to protect your own. You sacrificed me, Paul." He shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. No, I didn't want that. But you have to understand, I never had a choice. Not once I was in too deep. They own me. They own everything." Sandy's eyes softened just for a moment, before the anger flared back up again. "You think I care about your excuses? You could have come clean. You could have walked away." "What?" Paul opened his mouth to respond, but he was interrupted by the sharp sound of sirens in the distance. "They're coming," Paul said, his voice suddenly sharp with panic. "They'll finish what I started if they know I'm here. You need to get out. Now."